As a huge fan of Batman the Animated Series who considers it to be one of the greatest television shows of all time, it comes to no surprise that I adore the adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo. It remains one of my favorite superhero games ever made. No other video game based off this series managed to encapsulate it as well as this game did, at least in my opinion. There were ones released on the Game Boy, Game Gear, Sega CD, and even Sega Genesis. The Genesis one I hope to get to someday, but none of them hold a candle to the SNES one. It's a classic, iconic in every sense of the word. Simply put, The Adventures of Batman and Robin is a beautiful game, and immensely faithful to its source material. Its graphics, visuals, and music put you right into the Batman mood, and make you feel as though you are playing one big interconnected episode of the cartoon series. Each level is loosely based on specific episodes of the show. Some even take inspiration from several, which is really cool. Level 1, Amused to Death, is based off Christmas with the Joker, with Batman being forced to traverse a funhouse and take on a giant robotic nutcracker soldier. It even takes some elements from Be a Clown, with the final confrontation between Batman and the Joker taking place on a roller coaster. Level 2, No Green Peace, is inspired by Eternal Youth, with Batman facing off against Poison Ivy and her Demetrite-spraying goons. The final boss is the plant monster seen at the end of Poison Ivy's debut episode, Pretty Poison, as well. Tale of the Cat is based off The Cat in the Claw Part 1, with Batman's rooftop chase with Catwoman, as well as Cat Scratch Fever, because the title card of the level is basically identical to the one used for that episode. Perchance to Scream's title card is also similar to the one used for Nothing to Fear, and the events of the level itself feature a blimp used to disperse Scarecrow's fear toxin just like in the episode 2. Mind you, Scarecrow's design in this level is the second one he had in the show, and Nothing to Fear was his first appearance, when he looked a lot goofier. That has more to do with when this game entered development though, so you can't blame them for that. Besides, it doesn't matter, and this design for the character looked so much better. The Riddle Me This level, featuring Edward Nygma, the Riddler, is based off If You're So Smart, Why Aren't You Rich, and has Batman work his way through the maze of the Minotaur, culminating with a battle against the Minotaur to save Commissioner Gordon. You also face off against a virtual version of the Riddler, just like Batman did in the episode What is Reality? It has the chessboard and everything. And finally, the Gauntlet, the final part of the game, takes inspiration from the episode Trial, where Joker gathers all the villains to take out Batman, in this case, Penguin, Scarecrow, Clayface, Catwoman, and Man-Bat. The final confrontation with the Joker has him fly around on a jetpack, just like he did in the feature-length film Mask of the Phantasm. My favorite level in the game is the one featuring Riddler. Though there isn't any voice acting, of course, this is Super Nintendo, this version of the character, voiced by John Glover in the Batman animated series, is my favorite incarnation of the villain outside of the comics. The Maze of the Minotaur is a perfect setting for a level in a video game. Seeing as it was a video game itself in the show, it's quite fitting. I think it's easily the most compelling sequence of the game, because it has you solve various puzzles and riddles to reach the center of the maze, many of which are taken straight out of If You're So Smart, Why Aren't You Rich, which add to its charm. Many of the riddles are pretty self-explanatory and easy to figure out, but the one that has you enter the letters HB for human brain is a bit cryptic, unless of course you're familiar with the riddle itself, or have watched the specific episode of Batman the Animated Series the riddle draws from. The battle with the Minotaur at the center of the maze is a joke, and I could beat him blindfolded. All you have to do is dodge his incredibly slow attacks, make him walk to either side of the screen, wall jump over him, and get a bunch of hits in, seeing as he's so fucking slow. Rinse and repeat. That said, the final Riddler boss that sees him controlling chess pieces, a king and a queen, is a hell of a lot harder. It makes up for the easy Minotaur fight. Not only do you have to memorize their patterns, but you need to be careful where you let them drop down. The space you have at your disposal to dodge them depends on where that first one falls, and you can't jump over each piece either, by the way, so think a few steps ahead. It's easier said than done though. Despite my sheer admiration for this game in basically every way imaginable, it isn't without its issues, and man, do some of them suck. For starters, the Scarecrow level has him gas multiple civilians that run at Batman, believing he is an enemy. If they get too close, they grab you and hold you down until another criminal can run up and punch you or shoot you, whatever works for them. There are even sections that have toxic gas raise and lower, and these fear-induced civilians prevent you from ducking, causing you to take damage. The length in which they hold on to you seems very inconsistent. I don't know if there's a specific way to get them off or not. I just tend to mash buttons or spam the roll, but it doesn't seem to do anything. The civilians are fairly easy to avoid, you just need to jump over them, but if they do grab you, prepare to lose most, if not all of your life, each and every time. It's annoying. You might as well just take the controller from me for like 20 seconds. It's the exact same thing. Near the end of the Scarecrow level, you have to swing your way under the blimp using Batman's grapnel gun and smash through its window. Sounds easy enough. But no, it's pretty awkward using the gadget, and you'll find yourself falling to your death quite a bit. At least I do, multiple times. There are a few sequences in this game that utilize the grapnel gun, and every time it just feels awkward. Your timing has to be so precise, and it seems to have a mind of its own in terms of where it latches onto. Again, I might be doing something wrong, but I think they could have implemented this gadget a lot better, in all honesty. The Poison Ivy stage has you go up against her female goons, and you'll find that you can't punch them, only stun them using your batarangs. In fact, the level doesn't even let you punch at all. For the longest time, I always wondered why this was the case. Why can't you punch with Batman here? Well, I think it's because they're women. Simple as that. The game developers probably wanted to avoid releasing a game that has their hero beating the shit out of the opposite sex. I don't blame them. It's a bad image for kids. Look, mommy, I knocked her lights out. Yeah, not good. But easily the worst aspect of this game has to be the level featuring Two-Face called Trouble in Transit. I hate to say it. Why is Two-Face, one of Batman's greatest rogues, always fucked over in Batman games? Why is he always given the short end of the stick? Trouble in Transit features a top-down driving stage with the Batmobile, and by God, are the controls just terrible. This is one of the worst Batmobile driving stages I've ever played in a Batman game, hands down. Not only are the controls clunky as all hell, but the game adds insult to injury by giving you a time limit to complete the stage, a big middle finger right in your face. And this time limit, oh boy, they just give you just enough to reach the end, with seconds, even milliseconds to spare. And that's if you don't hit too many walls, street corners, and other vehicles. You basically can't fuck up, only a few times. If you hit into something and lose too much speed, or come to a complete stop, you might as well call it quits right there. You won't even make it, trust me. If you do somehow manage to catch up to Two-Face and his goons, you're not done, because there's a whole other section on a highway you must beat as well, with another unforgiving time limit. I'm dead serious. It even ends with a little battle against Two-Face's car. If you die too many times and have to use a continue, you'll have to start the entire level over from the beginning. It's frustrating. This part of the game is without question my least favorite, because it comes down to just trial and error. You have to go as fast as possible to beat the time limits, but that also means less time to process what's coming up in front of you. The civilian vehicles do damage you if you hit them, so yeah, this section is a complete mess. I hate it. Before the start of each level, you get to select which gadgets you want to bring with you, which is kind of a cool idea, but if you forget to bring certain ones in certain stages, then you're going to be making it a lot harder on yourself to complete them. In the Gotham Museum, you'll want to bring the flashlight so you can see the floor mines placed in the hallways. You don't want to have to jump around blindly to dodge them. In the Riddler's Maze, make sure to bring the X-ray goggles, as you will need them to locate false walls that you need to destroy with your plastic explosives to proceed. While I enjoy the idea of preparing yourself before each mission, it feels very Batman-like. Sometimes you have too many gadgets in your inventory you need to cycle through. When you're changing between them and end up passing the one you need by mistake, you have to cycle through them all again, rather than just push another button to go back. It's a bit of a nitpick, I admit, but it can be rather annoying at times, especially in Riddler's Maze, when you are frequently switching between Batarang to X-ray goggles to plastic explosives. You get the idea. This game is called The Adventures of Batman and Robin, so one would assume you can play as both Batman and Robin, right? But no, only Batman. Robin does aid you in a few of the missions, helping you navigate the museum so you can rescue the various security guards, and even helps you reach Scarecrow's blimp with the Batplane, but outside of that, he isn't playable. I'm not complaining though, because when I play Batman games, I want to play as Batman. I don't really have any intention of playing as anyone else. I assume this game's original title was simply Batman the Animated Series, and they only changed it to The Adventures of Batman and Robin because the show had been retitled to that partway through this game's development. Like I said at the start, The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo remains one of my favorite superhero games ever made. I think it's an incredibly faithful adaptation of its source material, and every time I play it, I'm overwhelmed with a sense of nostalgia. This was my Batman as a kid, and in many ways, it still is, no matter how many new versions of him come out. This game doesn't have that many levels, and in terms of length, they're relatively short when you really think about it. However, they are each pretty difficult in their own ways. I wouldn't call The Adventures of Batman and Robin an easy game. In order to get all the footage for this review, I utilized level passwords and even a few Game Genie codes in areas, and even still, it's no cakewalk by any stretch of the imagination. The Batmobile stage with those strict as hell time limits and frustrating controls, the awkward swinging with the grapnel gun, the pitfalls in Riddler's chess match, even invincibility cheats won't help you past it all. Eventually, you've got to man up and get good, sonny. This has been NerdGasm. If you've played it, let me know what you thought of The Adventures of Batman and Robin in the comment section down below. Is it one of your favorites too? If you want to help support the channel and everything it is that I do, make sure to subscribe, and if you can, head on over to patreon.com/channelnerdgasm and become a financial backer. It helps make videos like these a reality, and really keeps the YouTube channel, and my YouTube dreams for that matter, alive. Thanks for watching, and I will see all of you in the next one. Take care. The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo has always been one of my personal favorite superhero games. Not only is it simply a joy to play, but as an adaptation of the highly acclaimed Batman animated series many of us watched and enjoyed from the 1990s, there are none better. The character sprites, animations, level design, all of these elements come together to beautifully and faithfully recreate the look and feel of the show that inspired it. But The Adventures of Batman and Robin on SNES was not the only version of this game that had been made and released during the mid-90s. There were also console versions on the Sega Genesis, as well as its more powerful CD-ROM attachment, the Sega CD. Typically, licensed games like this, on both the Super Nintendo and Genesis, were, for all intents and purposes, fairly identical to one another regarding their overall designs and gameplay. The differences only really lied in the graphical styles and music capabilities of the hardware, which in most cases was pretty superficial. When talking about the three versions of The Adventures of Batman and Robin, however, this was not the case, as all three games looked and played quite different than the others. I've already discussed the SNES port in a separate video before, so check that out if you haven't done so already. But I wanted to take the next few weeks to review the two versions of the game published by Sega, starting with The Adventures of Batman and Robin on Genesis. Though it does utilize some platforming and beat-em-up elements like the Nintendo release, the Sega version is primarily a side-scrolling shooter that has you firing an infinite number of batarangs at all of the enemies that pop up on screen. You can hold down the attack button to continuously fire your batarangs, or wait until the meter beside your health and under your score fills up, at which point you can fire a more powerful variation of your batarang to do increased damage. Though honestly, I never really noticed much of a difference between the two. I never found using the stronger batarangs very useful, because in the time it would take you to connect with several of the strong batarangs, with a higher chance of missing their target, you could have just spammed the weaker ones and hit a lot more. I think both strategies have the same level of risk and reward to them, and equate to the same amount of damage in the end. unless of course you are in Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega Genesis Prodigy, and therefore never miss or get hit. In that case, the stronger batarangs are probably the better option, but for most of us playing, I don't think it really matters. Not only do you have the 2 different variations of the batarang in your arsenal, but you can also collect power-ups in the form of 3 different colored bat symbols enemies will drop: orange, blue, and green. The orange pickup imbues your batarangs with what I can only assume is fire. The blue one is electricity, and the green one may be a fart cloud or Scarecrow's fear gas. Who really knows? One thing the Genesis version of this game has over the Super Nintendo one is the option to play as both Batman and Robin. I always found it weird that you couldn't play as Robin in the SNES version, despite the game being called The Adventures of Batman and Robin. The Boy Wonder does pop up a few times to aid Batman in some of the levels, but not being able to actually play as him felt like false advertising. The other cool thing about the Genesis version is that there is cooperative multiplayer, so you can play as the dynamic duo side by side, taking down the forces of evil in Gotham. I got to capture the footage for this review playing the game with my twin brother, so that was awesome. But it was only awesome because we got to do something together. We didn't find the Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega Genesis to be all that fun or engaging. It's enjoyable for about 5 or 10 minutes, but after that, it becomes extremely repetitive and tiresome. It wouldn't be a problem if the levels in the game were shorter, but so many of them seem to just drag on and on and on. Some of the boss battles are agonizing and take forever to complete. Each of them is given 100 hit points, and it can sometimes take several batarangs to drop them down a single point, even when playing with 2 players. The Cheshire Cat in Wonderland, and especially the Mad Hatter, are 2 of my least favorite boss encounters in the game. They seem to last an eternity, and with Jervis, his battle has him constantly hiding in his giant top hat, between these annoying jumping sequences, having you dodge playing cards. It's an endurance of the mind, and just becomes tedious and dull by the end. It's like you're falling down the rabbit hole into madness while playing it, being driven insane from boredom. And this is really heartbreaking, because visually the game looks incredible. Dare I say, one of the best looking titles ever to be released on Genesis hardware. The levels are so colorful and vivid. There are so many neat things that catch your eye in the backgrounds. It's just that the gameplay is so excruciatingly repetitive that it saps the life right out of you after a few short hours. I now understand why Batman and Robin are standing on top of that tall skyscraper at the beginning, before the title screen appears. They want to jump off it, end their misery, before the player forces them through all of that torment again. Something I do really admire, though, about the Adventures of Batman and Robin on Genesis are its impressive and epic cutscenes at the beginning and end of the game, as well as its overall story. It centers around the Joker, Two-Face, and Mad Hatter breaking out of Arkham Asylum with the help of Mr. Freeze, who acts as this game's primary antagonist. His plan is to freeze Gotham City using a giant freezing cannon, which was an element used in the comics in the 1980s, as well as the 1997 film Batman and Robin. Having Mr. Freeze be the central villain here is quite unique, not something done in many Batman games, and helps the Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Sega Genesis stand out, despite the lack of excitement in its gameplay. I also love how the developers tried to adapt a few more of the villains from the animated series, like Freeze and Mad Hatter, that weren't featured in the SNES port, another aspect that helps it stand on its own from that game. One thing I do wish about the Genesis version, though, is that it had more cutscenes to tell its story. The first one, showing the breakout at Arkham, is creepy, and sets the tone for the rest of the game. and the last one, which depicts Freeze in his prison cell holding the snow globe with text over top, it's a nice way to close off the narrative, but all you get are those two. I think having more cutscenes in between each of the levels would have helped add extra layers to the game's story, ensured the player remained engaged with what they were doing, and most importantly, would have helped alleviate some of the game's repetitiveness by giving you a bit of a breather in between those long and grueling stages. A lot of people seem to remember the adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega Genesis fondly and enjoy it a great deal, but unfortunately I'm not one of them. It lacks the variety to its gameplay and the overall replayability that was found in the version of it on Super Nintendo. Its visuals are absolutely stunning, the soundtrack kicks ass, and the fact that it adapts Mr. Freeze as its main villain is commendable, but nowhere near enough to save it. The game is unnecessarily long and unsatisfying to play. From a purely gameplay perspective, it's one of the worst Batman games out there in my opinion. Harsh, I know. I want to thank you all for watching my review of the adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega Genesis. I hope I didn't piss off too many of you out there with this one, and you managed to find some level of enjoyment with this video. If you'd like to help support the production of content like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon for notifications, and become a producer over on patreon.com if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy. Out of all the video game adaptations of the adventures of Batman and Robin, by far the worst is the one developed by Clockwork Tortoise for the notorious CD-based attachment for the Sega Genesis, known as the Sega CD. For those of you unfamiliar with the Sega CD, it added hardware functionality to the Genesis, allowing it to play CD-ROM games that had a much larger storage space than cartridges. It had a faster CPU in it, and offered graphical enhancements like sprite scaling, rotation, and even boasted the ability of playing full motion video, though the quality of said video did vary a great deal across its game library. The Sega CD release of Batman Returns in May of 1993 had been a repackaged and amped up version of the baseline Sega Genesis game, sticking in several 3D racing levels featuring the Batmobile and Bat Ski Boat in between the side-scrolling and platforming ones from the original game. The driving stages were very impressive for the time and showed off the power and potential of the Sega CD and were a major influence on the style and direction Clockwork Tortoise would take the adventures of Batman and Robin in on the Sega CD as well. But instead of taking the run-and-gun version of the game they developed on the Genesis, and much like the Batman Returns game, simply beefed it up with a few driving stages, which, if you've seen my review of that game, would have done wonders for player engagement, they decided to have this one focus entirely on the driving aspect alone, and this decision was a bad idea, a very, very bad idea. The Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega CD is essentially a Batmobile driving simulator. All you do in it is drive forward, manage your speed, dodge obstacles, launch a few missiles to blow up enemy vehicles, and reach the end of each stage within a very strict time limit. It's basically glorified bumper cars, with a dash of those early Twisted Metal games thrown in for good measure. It's like Cruisin' USA, but just Gotham, USA. The amount of obstacles you will be forced to maneuver yourself around range in both size and speed, anything from civilian vehicles to giant pumpkins and other plant monsters grown by poison ivy, virtual chess pieces and dice created by the Riddler, to various amusement park attractions at Joker's Funland. The reaction time required to dodge some of this stuff is just disgusting, and the time limits get unforgiving the farther you get into this game. It gets to the point that if you hit anything and come to a complete stop in a stage, even once, you might as well just restart. It's an instant fail. The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Sega CD is one of the most difficult and frustrating games I have ever played. Because of the strict time limits, you want to be going really fast, but that means when you end up hitting something, you usually bounce all over the place, smacking into several other obstacles due to all of the momentum you have been building up. You don't even get any frames of invincibility between hits, so the Batmobile just takes shot after shot. If its damage level reaches 100%, you have to start the entire stage all over again. The final level of the game has you flying through Gotham Bridge with the Batplane, and manages to be even worse. First off, this bridge is the longest man-made structure in the history of the universe. It never seems to end, and the longer you play, the more it begins to piss you off. It's like the game is teasing you or something, dangling a carrot right in front of your face. Secondly, I don't understand why Batman doesn't just fly around the bridge, rather than attempt to squeeze the Batplane through all of these narrow gaps in the highway signs and bridge sections. They are damn near impossible to avoid, unless you are completely level, which is much easier said than done because you are racing to beat the clock, and are constantly being attacked by enemies. This entire sequence of the game is absolute trash, horribly designed, and just as horrible to play. The most noteworthy and positively remembered aspect of the Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Sega CD is its story, which was told through full-motion videos created by Warner Bros. Animation. They were written by Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, and feature the voice cast from Batman the Animated Series, everyone you would expect. The animated cutscenes are incredible, with some lasting several minutes at a time. They add up to around 17 minutes in total, and are considered by fans to be the lost episode of the TV series. The presentation and overall direction in them is on par with the quality of the show, and some of the elements depicted are quite interesting and unique. There's a battle between Batman and one of Poison Ivy's plant monsters in the Gotham Bank that has Batman swinging at it with a fireman's axe, chopping it to bits as the plant's blood splatters on the walls and in Batman's face. It's a dark visual, like something out of a slasher movie. In the Joker level, Harley Quinn tries to kill Batman with a popcorn cart at the amusement park, armed with explosives, which is pretty crazy. There's also a moment near the end of the game where Batman shoots one of Rupert Thorne's henchmen in the face with his grapnel gun to knock him out. I don't think I've ever seen that before. It was fucking awesome. I just wish the rest of the game's presentation, the gameplay, matched the quality of these cutscenes, and wasn't so frustrating and repetitive. You get a strong sense that the Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega CD was lacking in content, whether that was due to time constraints with its development or budgetary issues, if too many resources had gone into getting Warner Bros. Animation to create those epic cutscenes. While I do enjoy the full-motion videos, they obviously act as a way to pad out this game's length, which only clocks in at around 30 minutes. Those videos fill in the gaps between the cutscenes and the gameplay, but it all comes off as really lazy to me, an odd pairing, especially in the level featuring the Riddler, where he forces a virtual reality helmet on Batman and traps him in his virtual world. Instead of it being a series of cunning and brain-teasing puzzles, it's just more driving, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I will give the story of this game credit, though, for having Clayface be the primary villain. You don't see that very often. Posing as Rupert Thorne, he had manipulated all of the other villains to go after Batman, so it portrays him in a very intelligent and calculated way. Usually, that's not really the case. I would consider Clayface to be more impulsive with his actions over anything else. So I can sum up my thoughts on the Sega CD port of The Adventures of Batman and Robin in one word: disappointing. I would have a lot more respect for it and what it was trying to achieve if Clockwork Tortoise had released their original game on the Genesis with these new Batmobile stages and animated cutscenes acting as supplementary content between a few of the levels. Yeah, the Batmobile stuff is hard as shit, but at least it would have helped add some much needed variety to that Genesis game, which was disappointing and repetitive in its own right. I can't fully hate on any of these superhero games I look at though, regardless of their flaws, because so many of them bring me back to a simpler time. But if you are looking to play a faithful adaptation of Batman the Animated Series, then the only one I truly recommend from the 4th generation is The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo. The other ones on the Genesis and Sega CD pretty much suck. The SNES version is about as close to a masterpiece as these sort of games come, still one of my all-time favorite video games. I want to thank you all for watching my review. I hope you enjoyed it and found it insightful in some way. If you'd like to support this channel and its content, do so by subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, and becoming a producer over on patreon.com if you can. Any bit helps in keeping the YouTube dream alive. I will see you all in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and always stay nerdy. What better way to start off the new year than to review the new Superman Adventures on the N64? Released in 1999, Superman 64, as it's commonly known, is infamous for being not only one of the worst superhero games of all time, but one of the worst video games ever, period. I stayed clear of this game for years because of all the preconceptions I had towards it, and a lot of those preconceptions stemmed from the internet. There is an oversaturation of Superman 64 related content online, and all of it is, well, not the most positive. When I made the decision to play through this game to capture the footage required for this review, I was somewhat concerned regarding my mental well-being, knowing how frustrating it had been for countless other people to play and sit through over the years. However, another realization sunk in, a small level of excitement, morbid curiosity, knowing that I would finally be able to play this game for the first time ever and share my honest thoughts on it. So that's what I'm gonna do. Is Superman 64 really one of the worst superhero games ever made? Do I think it's the worst I've ever played? Let's find out. Superman on the N64 was released in May of 1999 in North America, and is based on the highly acclaimed Superman the Animated Series that was on TV at the time. It features a wide cast of characters from the show, and its story centers around Lex Luthor trapping Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Professor Hamilton in a virtual reality version of Metropolis after throwing them into some sort of Stargate-like contraption. Within this virtual world, Superman must battle with his awkward flailing punches the likes of Brainiac, who had helped build the virtual reality with Luthor, Mala, who plans on blowing up the Metropolis hydroelectric dam with a series of explosives you must disarm, Metallo, who is sent after Lois Lane when she begins investigating Luthor's plans, and Parasite, who intends on killing Professor Hamilton at Star Labs. Darkseid even makes an appearance holding Jimmy prisoner in the Daily Planet's underground parking garage, in a level I found to be quite frustrating because it's like one big maze. If some of the schemes for these villains don't make a whole lot of sense, Darkseid's especially, what the fuck is he doing in a parking garage and why would he give two shits about Jimmy Olsen? Keep in mind that this entire game is set within a virtual reality version of Metropolis. All the levels, all the boss characters you face, it's a fabricated version of Superman's reality, all artificial. None of it has to make any fucking sense. And because of this, it makes this whole game, its environment, feel a lot more lifeless than the dated graphics even make it out to be. It's hard to really be invested in anything going on or anything you are doing, even if the lives of your allies are in danger. It just feels empty, hollow. Maybe the developers thought they were being clever with all of this. It is a video game after all. Technically, it's all artificial, right? But regardless of whether or not you take that into account, I still don't think this concept works, or at least does not hold up after all this time. They should have just made it the actual Metropolis, have Superman face off against the actual supervillains, and not have them be virtual reality versions of themselves. It's just not that interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the rings. You knew I was going to. They are without a doubt the most hated and discussed element of this entire game. Superman on the N64 does feature some indoor levels, but the vast majority take place outside in the virtual metropolis. But rather than have you simply fly from point A to point B to get to your next objective so you can save your friends, you have to go through a series of rings with a time limit instead. And flying through these rings, oh boy, is it the drizzling shits. You are constantly battling the awkward joystick controls and hit detection with the buildings. Changing direction with Superman in the air is a lot harder than you might think. Flying through the rings seems like it would be easy, but it's not. Missing only a few of them results in failure, and you are forced to restart the entire ring section from the beginning if that happens. The time limit doesn't help, of course, and some of these sections give you barely enough to make it to the end. You really have to haul ass the entire time, and being that you are under pressure, you tend to make a lot more mistakes, and well, you know how frustrating that can be. Once you complete a timed ring section, you are then forced to take on some sort of challenge in order to save civilians. These civilians are virtual, so Superman shouldn't care for their safety, he's wasting his time, but I digress. Anyways, these tasks you are forced to do involve picking up and throwing objects, typically vehicles, carrying them through end goal checkpoints, blowing out tornadoes with your super breath, destroying countless LexCorp mine-launching robots, defeating a certain number of Dark Shadows, Luthor's army of cybernetic soldiers, and yeah, that's about it. You'll be doing this stuff over and over again on endless repeat. Between each indoor level, you might have to take on 1, 2, or 3 timed ring challenges with several of these boring and repetitive civilian missions in between. Saving the civilians can be tedious, but most of the objectives involving them are easy and take no time at all to complete. It's the rings that give you the most problems, and depending on how much difficulty you have with them, you can sometimes go hours before you get to play the next indoor section, desperate to see something new. Not to mention, if you are playing on the harder difficulties, for reasons I will bring up in a minute, the enemies in these civilian challenges act far more aggressive and make you fail a lot quicker and more frequently, and when that happens, regardless of the difficulty you are playing on, you don't start back at the civilian challenge. No. You will start back at the beginning of these ring sections. You'll end up playing the same thing over and over and over again on repeat, like you're flying in circles, literally. Superman is flying in fucking circles. While the indoor levels provide a change of pace to the shitstorm of frustration that are the rings, they aren't all that fun to play either. Yeah, you locate access cards and activate hidden computers to unlock doors, and even solve a few puzzles here and there, but they too get repetitive. Even the combat is garbage, because most enemies go down in a single hit, and the bosses, just mindless button mashing and nothing more. The only one I found to be somewhat challenging was Darkseid. I had to keep freezing him because his attacks did so much damage, and God forbid I would have to put myself through that annoying underground parking garage level again. It was terrible. Speaking of Darkseid, his battle features one of the funniest moments in this entire game, and I don't think it was intentional. After you drain his health to 0, he falls down and T-poses on the ground. It's at this point that you have to pick him up and carry him to the police, so he can be arrested, until Superman can take him back to Apocalypse or something. It's not really explained very well. but the fact that one of the strongest beings in the entire DC universe is just lifted up in a fixed T-pose and carried over to police for safekeeping is one of the funniest fucking things I have ever witnessed playing these kinds of games for the channel. It was insane. Anyways, the worst boss battle, or I guess the worst villain encounter in this entire game, would have to be the Parasite, hands down. The AI with him makes zero sense, and he comes off like a buffoon. So right when the Star Labs level starts, you have to save Professor Hamilton. Parasite begins attacking you. I mean, he's located in the same room you are at the beginning. It makes sense. But once you deal enough damage to him, Parasite just stops attacking and stands there, allowing you to walk around and figure out where to go next. Once you locate Hamilton in the lower levels behind a laser barrier, you then have to go back up to the same room with Parasite and activate 3 computer terminals, and of course, he begins attacking you again. Once all 3 are activated, you guessed it, he stops attacking you and tells you you'll never defeat me without Hamilton's help. It's at this point you return to Professor Hamilton. He helps you turn on a force field trap to stop Parasite, and you humorously lure the villain into it without much pushback. And that's all that happens. It's pretty pitiful. What's really sad is that Parasite could be the final boss for you, depending on how you play this game. You see, in Superman 64, you can get one of 3 endings essentially. I know, seems complex, doesn't it, for a shitty game like this. If you play on easy mode, the final level is against Parasite. If you play on normal, you get one in the Metropolis subway against a giant Lexbot. And if you beat the game on hard, you get a series of annoying puzzles and a final encounter with Brainiac on his starship. Each difficulty expands the game by 1 additional level, so in order to get the full ending, the true ending, you have to beat this piece of shit game on the hardest difficulty setting, and that means rings. Rings up the ass. So many rings you'll be begging for Superman to break your neck just like he did General Zod's in Man of Steel. But what if I told you there was a simple way to turn off the rings? Turn off those dreadful ring challenges sprinkled throughout so much of this game, allowing you to focus on everything else with it. The combat, the indoor levels, the boss battles, the story, or what little there is of a story at least. It's something no one seems to really talk about regarding this game, information nobody seems to want to share with the rest of the world. All you have to do is play on easy mode, and voila, it turns off all the rings. Sure, the flying sequences become far more boring without them, giving you a time limit to essentially fly right into a spinning Superman logo to start your next objective, and the sandbox of Metropolis with its terrible draw distance is a lot more barren without those flashy rings laid all throughout it, but it makes Superman 64 resemble more of a game. It makes it far more tolerable and in turn playable. Even if you do manage to beat this game on its highest difficulty setting, called Superman mode, the ending is insulting. All that happens is Superman's allies are rescued from the virtual world, and then the game tells you that Lex Luthor is still free in the real one. So yeah, it all seems like a big fuck you, doesn't it? A complete waste of time. One of the biggest issues I had with Superman 64, disregarding all the other crap I just mentioned, is the fact that using Superman's powers require you to find pickups scattered throughout the levels. The idea of Superman not being able to use his super breath or laser vision until you find a pickup for it feels really wrong, fundamentally wrong. As Superman, you should not be held back in this way. You should have access to all of his abilities at any given time. The Man of Steel feels kind of weak in this game. He's been nerfed. I know in the Superman animated series, the show's creators made Superman weaker than his comic book counterpart, having him become physically injured much easier to make him more relatable to the audience, and that was fine. I didn't have a problem with it in the context of that show. But here, it's a video game for Christ's sake. You should be able to use all of Superman's powers, to deal with all of the obstacles put in your way. You want to feel like Superman, you want to feel empowered, but here you don't, not really. Unfortunately, there is a sad story as to why Superman was weakened like this in the game, and actually it explains a lot of the issues found within Superman on the Nintendo 64. I do not blame the developers for the final product. They tried their best to make the most faithful Superman game that they possibly could, given their situation. You see, the development of Superman on the N64 took place over the span of 2 years, and shortly into that development window, shortly after the developers Titus had acquired the rights to make a Superman game, the licensing team at Warner Bros. Changed. This new team had animosity towards the developers of Superman 64 and believed the game they were making was going in the wrong direction. They wanted a bigger developer to work on it because that way they could make more money from licensing out the IP. Every decision Titus had made regarding Superman 64 had to be passed by the licensing team at Warner Bros., and they fought tooth and nail with Titus over every little detail, slowing down the entire development process. The WB licensing team mandated several things that Titus had to include in their Superman game. They had to make it so that Superman would be viewed in a positive light. To do so, they had to limit the use of his powers. I guess if players got trigger happy with the laser vision and began zapping everything in sight, it would have been a bad image for the Man of Steel, or at least in the eyes of the licensing team at the time. They also wanted to make sure that Superman wouldn't harm civilians, and thus the entire city of Metropolis was turned into a virtual one, completely eliminating civilians altogether, apart from the ones you save in those brief challenges or within the indoor levels, of course, but again, they aren't real. The horrendous rings that you are forced to fly through for what feels like 90% of the game were only supposed to be part of the tutorial, and that's it. Problem is, due to the licensing team forcing the virtual world setting onto the game, not to mention the pressure they were putting on the developers, which slowed everything down, Titus was forced to implement the rings into more of the game, not only due to the fact that they fit in with the virtual world aesthetic, but because they were a simple way to pad out the game's length. With all these changes Titus was forced to make and the rules mandated to them by the Warner Bros. Licensing team, it's a miracle the game is in the state it is now. It could have been much worse. The development process of Superman 64 sounds like a complete dumpster fire. I'm surprised Titus was able to get anything done on it. The sad thing is, I do believe there was a good, or at least decent, Superman game somewhere in here, buried deep beneath all of these fucking rings. If the immature and misguided licensing team at Warner Bros. Had just given Titus a chance with this IP, and not just focus on how much money they could have made off the whole project elsewhere, I feel Titus could have made something Superman fans could have really enjoyed, at least at the time. Would the game have been perfect? God no. But for the first ever 3D Superman game, it most likely would have been passable. You would have been able to sink a lot more time into it and enjoy it far more than you do the current version. And speaking of versions, following the critical and commercial failure of Superman on the N64, Titus had given their resources to Blue Sky Software to make an updated version of the game on the original PlayStation, which probably would have seen a release sometime in 2000 or possibly 2001. The graphics and level design were updated. There were new cutscenes which added more focus and structure to the game's story. New villains would be included like Mr. Mixie's Pitlick, and some levels even implemented the use of various suits, which was something the Superman animated series explored here and there. Of course, this game never came to be, despite being approved by Sony, as the licensing rights from Warner Bros. Expired and the whole project fell through. It's a damn shame, because I think it would have undone a lot of the wrongs the N64 game had given us, and dare I say, it may have become one of the best Superman games ever released. And guess what? There were no rings, so automatically it's a masterpiece compared to the N64 version. Superman on the N64 is bad. It's a bad superhero game. There is no sense denying it, but I think a lot of people are too harsh on it, not realizing what was going on behind the scenes between Titus and Warner Brothers. The game was essentially sabotaged from day one, and it was destined to be a rushed and unfinished mess. The story of Superman 64 is a sad one, and kind of a what-if scenario. I love Superman the Animated Series, and I just wish it had been given a game all of us fans could have really sunk our teeth into. It deserved so much better. Something I do want to make perfectly clear about this game, though, is that Superman 64 is not the worst superhero game I have played when the rings are turned off, and that is important. I can't stress that enough. Playing without rings can be kind of fun in a humorous way, a so bad it's good kind of way. The game is tolerable, somewhat enjoyable, but when you play with the rings, when you play on hard mode, this game is excruciating. One of the most difficult games I have ever attempted to beat, not because you necessarily lack the skills to get the job done, but because you lack the immense patience required to complete it. You don't need me to tell you that doing the same thing over and over again, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of times, because Lord knows how many rings in total are in this game, quite frankly, I don't want to know, is straining on one's patience. I swear this game could be used as a means of psychological torture. It could hold its own against some of the most brutal forms of torture ever conceived. Am I exaggerating? Maybe a little bit, but just a little bit. Well, that concludes my review of Superman on the Nintendo 64. Do I recommend it? Of course not. What do you think, I am crazy? But I also don't think it's as bad as a lot of people say it is when you turn off those pesky rings, and only when you turn off those pesky rings. Because if you have them on, and if you are playing on the hardest difficulty setting to get that final ending, then you are looking at the worst superhero game in existence that I have played thus far at least. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified of all the future content I release. If you would like to have a say in which superhero game I look at next, fast track a particular one you want me to talk about, you can become a producer for my channel over on patreon.com/channelNerdGasm. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy. Now, last week, I reviewed what many consider to be the pinnacle of shitty superhero games, Superman on the Nintendo 64. Its awkward flight and combat controls, dated and dull polygonal graphics, shallow story, and of course, endless rings that dastardly Lex Luthor has you flying through within his virtual reality metropolis has made it a popular punching bag of internet gamers and critics since time immemorial. It goes without saying that Superman on the N64 was a massive disappointment, but one must keep in mind that this was all due to its ill-fated development behind the scenes, which I would suggest watching my previous review for more info on. Despite Superman 64 shitting the bed in grandiose fashion when it was released in 1999, the Man of Steel would get another game based off his appearance in the Superman animated series, called Superman Shadow of Apocalypse, which hit store shelves a mere 3 years later, in 2002. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you out there have never even heard of this game before. I never knew it existed until only a few years ago, when I made the conscious decision to review the title at some point down the road. Following the disaster that was Superman 64, I think Shadow of Apocalypse flew under a lot of people's radar. Get it? Flew? Anyways, I would assume the excitement level for a game like this was pretty much non-existent at that time. Despite being on more advanced hardware with superior graphics, Shadow of Apocalypse on the surface looked like it could just end up being the exact same game in the end, with a new coat of paint, like pouring Crystal Light into a bucket of piss. Gamers probably didn't want to take their chances with it and passed on buying it. Thankfully, I come to you today with relatively good news. Superman Shadow of Apocalypse is not a complete dumpster fire like its predecessor. In many ways, it's everything Superman on the N64 originally aimed to be, and then some. You actually feel like the Man of Steel playing it, flying through a 3D metropolis, using a lot of his iconic powers and abilities, and taking on a series of noteworthy villains. Shadow of Apocalypse features a much stronger narrative than the one found in Superman on N64, or lack thereof. It's not flawless by any stretch of the imagination. It does feel somewhat uneventful at times, even a bit monotonous with some of the stuff the game actually gets you to do on the gameplay side of things, which I will get to in a minute, but it's still a heck of a lot better than what we were used to in Superman games, especially at the time. Following a nasty battle with Superman in the streets of Metropolis, John Corbin, Metallo, is taken to Stryker's Island prison, where Star Lab scientists manage to remove his head, putting him out of commission for the time being. Superman is notified by the police that the criminal organization known as the Intergang have seemingly returned to the city. The Man of Steel quickly determines that this Intergang is simply a group of robots using many of the gang's old methods. He labels them Interbots, and they have been enhanced, given special weapons powered by some sort of fusion energy that can harm Superman. Lex Luthor is revealed to be the mastermind behind these Interbots and sends them to track down and capture all of the scientists in Metropolis, including Superman's close friend, Professor Hamilton. He forces these scientists to work with his own at LexCorp to recreate as many of these highly advanced fusion weapons as possible. Now, this technology had come from a mysterious benefactor, the ruler of Apocalypse himself, Darkseid. He has employed the aid of Lex Luthor on Earth to help him destroy the last son of Krypton, so he can then conquer the planet unopposed. Darkseid pops in throughout the story numerous times, and he makes sure that Luthor is being continuously monitored in case he gets any wise ideas and fails to realize his true place beneath Darkseid's boot. Anywho, the Interbots eventually release Metallo from Stryker's prison, and his head is reattached to his body. It's at this point several other Superman villains are also released by Lex Luthor, such as Livewire and the Parasite, in the hopes of killing Big Blue. Luthor manages to manipulate Metallo into going after Superman, posing as some sort of mysterious disembodied alien head thing, though Corbin would instead go to LexCorp so he could first kill Luthor out of revenge for turning him into a cyborg. Superman intervenes and battles Corbin within Luthor's office, and man, do you fuck that place up, depending on how much damage you deal to it. The fight then reaches a weapons factory, where you throw Metallo into pressing machines that do increased damage. Like something out of the Terminator movies, Metallo's artificial skin is melted off his body when molten steel is dropped on him. You then knock him into some kind of magnetized claw thing, which rips his head off once again, in pretty gruesome fashion. The story of this game is fairly intriguing, featuring a lot of the main beats you'd find in an episode of Superman the Animated Series. Despite the game's title being Shadow of Apocalypse, don't expect any kind of epic boss fight against the big man himself though, Darkseid. He plays the role of a side character in this game, watching in the wings as everything else unfolds. He's featured only in the cutscenes, so don't get too excited. You get a sense that Shadow of Apocalypse was building into something greater, and that Darkseid would have been heavily featured in a sequel. Unfortunately, it never saw the light of day, and, as a result, the ending of this game leaves you feeling a bit unsatisfied. Having Metallo be the final boss was awesome, don't get me wrong. I love that character and his interpretation in Superman the Animated Series, but it would have been even better if you had gotten a memorable battle with Darkseid as well, especially coming off that laughable encounter with him from the N64 game. Some Superman fans claim Shadow of Apocalypse is the best video game ever released based on the Man of Steel, and I mean from a purely visual standpoint, they're not wrong. This game is very faithful to its source material. It looks just like the animated series did, and its stylized, cel-shaded graphics have a certain appeal to them. I wish more games were made using them. They look awesome. When enemies are firing their weapons at you, sometimes you will see the bullets bouncing off of Superman's body, if you look closely enough, and it only works in the darker levels obviously. The flashing effects and coloring remind me of those old Fleischer cartoons from the 1940s. Many of the voice actors from the series also reprise their iconic roles. Tim Daly plays Superman, Dana Delaney is Lois Lane, Clancy Brown voices Lex Luthor, Malcolm McDowell is Metallo, and Lori Petty portrays Livewire. The only major voice actor absent here is Michael Ironside, with his badass depiction of Darkseid from the DC animated universe. Kevin Michael Richardson voices the character in his place, which I mean ain't a bad choice, but he just can't fill Ironside's jackboots. Let's be real.
Yes, and I shall be watching both of you closely. Very closely indeed, Superman.
I think anyone who has played Shadow of Apocalypse before would agree with me when I say that its controls and overall mechanics are a vast improvement over those found in Superman 64. However, it still has quite a lot of issues with it that made my playthrough very frustrating. Superman Shadow of Apocalypse may be a fun game to play in spurts, but it's not all that fun to complete. The controls, while vastly superior to the N64 title, are still incredibly clunky, and, depending on how you look at them, they can be both overcomplicated and oversimplified, if that makes any sense. Shadow of Apocalypse is not an open-world game, so don't get your hopes up. It consists of several levels, with some just being larger than others. When your play area is expanded though, in these bigger levels, you do have the freedom to fly around a little bit. Flying is initiated by pressing the right analog stick up, which makes you hover. You then have to hold the R2 button to fly forward, and pressing X along with R2 performs a boost. When you want to return to the ground, you need to press and hold the right analog stick down, which can be really awkward, especially during some of the levels that have time limits. Superman tends to go in directions you don't want him to, or stay in the air when all you really want him to do is land. Countless times when I was playing this game, I found myself fighting with the flight controls just as much as I was fighting with the enemies. The controls are not as responsive and intuitive as I think they should be. What would a Superman game be without combat? In Shadow of Apocalypse, the Man of Tomorrow can dish out justice by tapping the X button. The punch animations are a much-needed upgrade from the bizarre and goofy ones found in Superman 64. By holding X, you can pick up enemies when they are stunned, even items in the environment to use as weapons, such as nearby piping that Superman rips from the wall. Double tapping X also allows you to throw whatever you are holding, turning it into a devastating projectile. Superman has a few special combat moves that he can perform by pressing square and X at the same time. One is a fast spinning attack, and another is a ground slam, which is done while hovering. Both of these are great for crowd control when you are being swarmed by Interbots. Unlike Superman on the N64, Shadow of Apocalypse doesn't force you to find specific pickups in order to use Superman's iconic powers. Now you can perform his super breath and heat vision with a simple press of a button, as long as you have energy remaining in your power meter, which, don't worry, fills up by itself over time, how it should be. Something else that replenishes itself over time is Superman's health meter, a fun and reasonable way to adapt a character like this into a video game, one that is more or less a walking solar battery. It makes sense. Honestly, Super Breath is only used a few times throughout the game. The power you will be utilizing the most is your heat vision. Holding triangle activates it, but double tapping triangle releases a blast of heat energy, almost like a missile. It is essential that you spam this attack at certain points in order to do massive amounts of damage to stronger enemy types, like the jetpack Interbots, tanks, and of course, bosses. I mentioned already that you will sometimes find yourself fighting with the game's controls, and the worst levels of Shadow of Apocalypse really exacerbate this issue. Some of the levels that have Superman in smaller and constricting areas can become awkward due to the fact that you are unable to move the camera freely. The stealth mission where you play as Clark Kent infiltrating LexCorp is downright atrocious. Staying out of sight from the scientists and avoiding the mines that are floating around can be a real challenge when you can't move the camera freely to effectively see your surroundings. It comes down to trial and error, with you being forced to memorize the level's layout, which is just no fun. Each time you fail, you are forced to sit through a fairly long loading screen as well, which is irksome. All of the levels in this game that involve time limits can also go fuck themselves. You are given barely enough time to complete your objectives. Much like the stealth mission, it's trial and error. You have to do them until you have found the most efficient route possible, without making any mistakes, which feels incredibly unforgiving seeing as children would have been playing this game. The most brutal of them all was the one that had you carry 4 coolant containers to a nuclear reactor inside of a volcano. You have to pick each one up at the end of 4 separate tunnels filled with obstacles. Racing back to the reactor, you'll have to dodge falling boulders, spewing lava and fire. If the boulders hit you, Superman will just drop the coolant, the best case scenario. You can still salvage your run if this happens, as long as you don't take too long trying to pick it back up again with these cumbersome controls. Easier said than done. However, if the lava comes in contact with the coolant at any point, the container is just destroyed, and you have to go all the way back to the end of the tunnel to get another one again. It's basically an instant fail, because you'll lose too much time backtracking. This section gives you barely enough time to get all 4 coolant containers before the reactor ruptures. You basically can't fuck up, not even once. I did enjoy my time with Superman Shadow of Apocalypse. It was a strong improvement over the N64 Superman game, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. The controls and camera are really wonky at times, the collision detection is pretty inconsistent, and while the story can be somewhat engaging, the actual objectives you are doing in each of the levels can become very repetitive. You battle the same enemies over and over again. You are sent to destroy this or carry that, protect a certain number of civilians. All of it can get really dull and falls kind of flat by the end. I would still consider this game as being the best Superman has ever had though. I know a lot of you out there might be angry at that opinion, feeling other titles such as The Death and Return of Superman, Superman Returns, or hell, even the Injustice games deserve to be higher on that list. But I just feel, despite all of its flaws, it just gets the Superman character a lot better than all of those other games do. And I mean, it's an adaptation of the Superman animated series from the late 1990s, the one I grew up with, and what I consider to be the greatest version of Superman outside of the comics, so maybe I'm just a little biased. It is a shame that Shadow of Apocalypse never got a sequel though. With some more polish and content, it could have been something special. Imagine taking the fight to Darkseid on Apocalypse, having the story be set in outer space, or at the very least, have several levels set in outer space. You could have not only battled earthly enemies, but also stronger creatures like the parademons. You might have even been able to squeeze Lobo into the story somehow, have him go after Superman. That would have been really cool. I had a lot of frustration in areas playing Shadow of Apocalypse, but I do think its positives outweigh the negatives. It's a lesser-known title in Superman's video game library that deserves a lot more love and attention than it currently gets. Because of the immense failure of Superman 64, Shadow of Apocalypse became buried in obscurity, but it is a decent superhero game, far from amazing, but still worth some of your time nonetheless. I want to thank everyone for watching this review, and if you've played it before, I would love to hear your thoughts on this game down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video and have not done so already, please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell icon so you can be notified whenever I release new content. Thanks once again for tuning in. Stay nerdy, take care, and see you next time. If you thought The Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega CD was the only Batman game foolish enough to take place entirely behind the wheel of the Batmobile, you'd be wrong. This is Batman Gotham City Racer, developed by Ubisoft, and released for the original PlayStation in 2001. This game is really rough to look at, not very impressive in the graphics department. By the time it came out, the PlayStation 2 had been on the market for half a year, and gamers didn't have to wait long, only a few months, for a far more layered Batman experience in Batman Vengeance, also developed by Ubisoft. So Gotham City Racer had barely anything going for it when it hit store shelves, apart from what could be taken at face value, the ability to drive the Batmobile and race around Gotham City. Though its name would suggest a racing game, calling it that is very generous. All you do in this game, spanning its 51 levels, is soulless busywork. You zigzag your way across the same 4 or 5 city locations to reach certain landmarks, to rendezvous with characters like Commissioner Gordon, stop robberies, or disarm bombs, all within time limits. There really isn't much of a story to speak of here, because the narrative of this game drives in circles, literally. Villains do crimes. You stop those crimes. They get arrested and placed in Arkham. They break out and then do more crimes. It's like a broken record, though I guess this is what it would really be like to patrol Gotham City as Batman. He doesn't kill, and none of his villains ever get properly rehabilitated. It's Groundhog Day for him, an endless living nightmare that you now get to experience in video game form. Yay! There are a ton of iconic Batman villains featured in Gotham City Racer, based on their likenesses from the new Batman adventures, but they only appear in specialized vehicles, armed with gimmick weapons, sort of like Twisted Metal. Mr. Freeze creates ice patches on the road. The Riddler puts down question mark boxes. The Mad Hatter uses giant green top hats. And the Joker has these annoying balloons that make your camera go all shaky when you collide with them. It gives me a headache. You have other rogues like Clayface, Firefly, and even Roxy Rocket, but they aren't even given vehicles. When you reach the end of their respective stages, they just automatically get imprisoned at Arkham Asylum. It's really lazy on the part of the developers, though to be honest, if they had given Firefly a vehicle to drive around in, that would have been a new level of retarded. He has wings for fuck's sake. In some of the missions, you will have to tail the supervillains without being seen, which just means you can't hit them. I hate these levels, because this is when the shitty AI of the game is at its worst. The villains just drive down the center of the road like drunks. They don't make any attempt to avoid incoming traffic. Sometimes when they hit something, you aren't anticipating it and hit them by mistake, causing you to fail. Other times, like when I was chasing Two-Face, they just get caught on walls and you are unable to progress, which I mean is always lovely to see in games like this, right? Level 48 has you drive to City Hall to stop the Scarecrow, and when you arrive, you learn that he has been fighting Batgirl. She ends up getting injured, and you have to drive her back to the Batcave for treatment. I hope to God this is not an attempt to reference Over the Edge, the best episode from the new Batman adventures, because if so, that's insulting. How dare this game provide such a horrendous adaptation? From what you can see from this footage, I'm sure it comes to no surprise when I say that Batman Gotham City Racer plays like absolute ass. The Batmobile slides around all over the place, like all the roads in Gotham have been covered with slick oil. When you hit walls and other obstacles, you tend to bounce all over the place, and a few levels have you drive the Batcycle as Batgirl, which somehow manages to control even worse, though I would hesitate to call whatever the hell this is supposed to be a motorcycle. I didn't even know what I was looking at when I first played this game, a jumbled mess of polygons with wheels. If you feel real crazy and want a challenge, you can turn on first-person mode as well, though I would highly recommend you have a barf bag at the ready, as it can be very disorienting. I should mention that this game also has a patrol mode, which basically acts like free play. You can choose one of the city locations and play as either the hero vehicles or the villain ones. As the villains, you drive around committing robberies, stealing bags of cold hard cash, and facing off against the heroes, Twisted Metal style. It's honestly kind of fun, the most fun I had playing this game, which honestly isn't saying much. Batman Gotham City Racer is considered by many to be one of the worst Batman games ever made. I would have to agree, because it doesn't offer much content to it in terms of story and gameplay. It feels very unfinished, rushed. The graphics were dated even when it came out. The vehicles handle like soapboxes, and the enemy AI is just pathetic. Now, originally, I was gonna skip over this game when finishing up the last of my DC Animated Universe game reviews, but I felt ignoring a piece of bat guano this size would be wrong, and when else would I get the chance to talk about it? I'm sure there are some people out there that genuinely enjoy this game and would defend it, but I would just label them psychotic. They're probably clawing at the walls of Arkham Asylum as we speak. This has been NerdGasm. I hope you had more fun watching my review of Gotham City Racer on PS1 than I had playing through it. This is a trashy superhero game, one you will want to avoid at all costs. It's a lazy attempt at a racing game, with the name of Batman slapped onto it. If you enjoyed the video, show your support and ensure the creation of more content like this by subscribing to my channel, hitting that bell icon for notifications, and becoming a producer over on patreon.com if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy. Batman Vengeance, developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in the fall of 2001 for the PlayStation 2, is an interesting title for me to talk about in Batman's video game library, because despite its positive reviews upon release, it's widely considered to be one of the best Batman games of all time, and Batman is of course my favorite superhero. I don't really have a lot of experience with it. I never owned Batman Vengeance when I was younger. I never got the chance to play it as a kid. I got my first PS2 a few years into its lifespan, so I never saw the game's launch in action, never saw any copies of the game on store shelves, and years later, I could never find it in any of the discounted used bins, for whatever reason. Maybe it was just really popular, or rare. Back then, I didn't have the resources to track down any specific game like I do now, so Batman Vengeance was just one of those games that passed me by. Now, of course, I do remember it, and I remember wanting it. There were commercials that would air on television. I think it was even featured in an episode of Video and Arcade Top 10, a show I used to watch on YTV up here in Canada that would show footage of all the latest games. Though I can't seem to find the episode number, so maybe it's just a case of the Mandela effect. Who knows? Regardless, Batman Vengeance, despite being this classic and iconic Batman game that so many die-hard fans of the character put in high regard, is one this Batman fan never got to play and experience firsthand as a kid, which, when I phrase it like that, sounds kind of depressing. But don't feel bad for me, because I own the game now, and I can play it whenever I see fit. But I wanted to bring all of this up to give you guys perspective with this video, with this review, because even though I am a Batman fan, I don't have any nostalgic biases towards this game in particular. My views on it have not been warped or influenced by any past memories I have with it. I'm not viewing it from the lens of my inner child or anything like that, like I have done with some of my past reviews. This video is going to be very genuine, unbiased, and recording the footage for this review, it was only the second time in my life I had played this game from start to finish, so my opinions on this title are very fresh, very raw. Anywho, Batman Vengeance is a 3D platformer that puts emphasis on Batman's combat skills and vast array of unique gadgets with its gameplay. There are a total of 19 levels in the game, and they offer quite a bit of variety to them. Some place you in indoor environments, some in more open areas, like a series of Gotham rooftops for example, and there are even a couple driving stages with the Batmobile and Batwing to switch things up. The Batcave is featured in this game, but not as much as I would have liked. Apart from a training mission you do in one of the side rooms at the beginning of the story, and the occasional cutscene that is Batman talking to Batgirl at the Batcomputer, you don't really get to explore it, which is a real shame. There isn't a whole lot to do there, it's basically an empty area, but I would have liked to see the Batcave act as a hub location in between levels or something, allowing you to access them with the Batmobile maybe. Like I said, Batman Vengeance puts a large emphasis on Batman's combat and gadgets, and even though this game is 20 years old, a bit dated in areas, I thought the gameplay was pretty solid and really fun, for the most part. The combat system is really effective in my opinion, because it doesn't make Batman feel too overpowered. Taking out each criminal feels like a true fight, a back and forth contest. You have to hold down the block button and wait for your moment to strike, try to take your opponent off guard, and string together enough blows to deal damage, sometimes knocking them off their feet. When the power meter below your health begins to fill up by hitting strikes or getting hit yourself, you can activate several takedown moves by holding L2 and simply pressing an easy sequence of attack buttons, depending on which takedown you want to perform. The fuller your power meter is, determines which takedowns you can perform, and each one deals a certain amount of damage to your opponent. These takedowns are incredibly satisfying to pull off, and mastering them can allow you to turn the tables in a fight almost instantly. If you want to avoid combat altogether or disarm enemies of their weapons, you can do so by throwing batarangs at them, tie them up with nets, or shock them using stun rounds, as long as you have ammo for these gadgets in your inventory, which can be found throughout the levels. Whenever an enemy is defeated, they will remain unconscious for a limited time, and will hop back up to fight you again. So if you have any handcuffs in your inventory, you'll want to make sure to use them as frequently as you can. The game tells you that you can use stealth to avoid combat as well, but unfortunately, it's not implemented very well in this game. Batman can hug walls to move through certain obstacles, and in the training sequence in the Batcave, the way you're taught to use it, one would assume it could be used to sneak by criminals too, but it never works. Not only are you not given any opportunities to really try that tactic out, but enemies will hear you regardless of what you do, so stealth is never really a factor. You forget it's even there. It's completely pointless. And let's talk about the first-person mode, because this is how you use all of the gadgets in this game. While not completely terrible, it doesn't make or break your overall enjoyment of Batman Vengeance. It's also not ideal and kind of awkward. Constantly having to switch between third-person and first-person perspective can become a bit disorienting, because it breaks up the flow of gameplay. The camera in this game is also fixed and cannot be adjusted outside of using the first-person mode, which leads to a few frustrating deaths at times, because you are unable to line up jumps properly. The story of Batman Vengeance spans 5 episodes: A Girl to Die For, In Cold Blood, Plant Food, Fool's Grave, and Infernal Jest, all presented similarly to episodes of the original Batman animated series, all with their own title cards in the form of loading screens. Though the title card concept comes from Batman the Animated Series, the overall visual design of this game is based off its sequel show, The New Batman Adventures. If you were to consider this game canon within the DC animated universe, then it would most likely take place before the start of the New Batman Adventures, due to the absence of Robin and Nightwing. However, the game does feature Batgirl, who aids you from within the Batcave, feeding you useful information throughout the levels. Episode 1, A Girl to Die For, has Batman rescue a woman named Mary at Gotham Chemicals from a bomb planted several feet away from her. The Joker had kidnapped her son Toby and is demanding a large ransom for his return. The Dark Knight manages to track the Joker to Gotham Bridge and battles the villain, swinging on a giant wrecking ball. It's revealed that Mary was Harley Quinn all along, and her son Toby was just a ruse to trap Batman. The episode ends with a fun confrontation between Batman and the Joker, one of the few instances you actually get to lay your hands on Joker in these more modern 3D era games, and the Joker is knocked off the bridge by Batman. He tries to save his foe, but is electrocuted by Joker's joy buzzer, and the villain meets his untimely demise. Episode 2, In Cold Blood, centers around Mr. Freeze. He attacks Gotham Industrial Research in order to kill a scientist there named Isaac Evers, who had created a form of medicine known as liquid promethium for the cryogenically frozen, a drug Mr. Freeze had used on himself and his wife Nora in the hopes of curing them of their ailments, but it was unsuccessful. Freeze wants revenge against Evers, and you find out through Batgirl that Evers lost the government funding for his research because the liquid promethium drug was far too flammable and may have reached out to the Joker for funding instead. While tracking down Evers' financial records on a data disk in cold storage, Batman is attacked by Mr. Freeze. The encounter you have with the villain is one of the more memorable in this game. It has you detonating remote charges to drop cryotanks onto Mr. Freeze, eventually cracking his helmet and forcing Batman to use his own freeze gun against him to cover him in a protective layer of ice to save his life. Episode 3, Plant Food, features Poison Ivy. She has been blackmailing rich socialites in Gotham, including Mayor Hamilton Hill, after infecting them with worm-like plants that require a special kind of plant food to satiate their hunger, or else they begin to devour their hosts. You get to take on one of Ivy's mutated plant goons, the one seen in the episode House and Garden from Batman the Animated Series. Batgirl is even attacked by a group of humanoid plant creatures, and you have to rescue her on a moving train, which is pretty cool. The episode culminates with a battle against a giant plant monster within Gotham Chemicals. Batman manages to electrocute it, as well as Ivy, and he is able to retrieve the antidote to save all of her victims. Episode 4, Fool's Grave, has Batman spot a group of criminals dressed as mimes, hijacking a blimp, believing Joker may have somehow been responsible. He speaks with Harley Quinn, who has given up her life of crime following the death of the Joker, and tells Batman that some of Joker's men are still operating without him, and that they have stolen some of his toys, as well as the blueprints to Gotham Gas Works. Batman learns that they have been placing firebomb jack-in-the-boxes into Gotham pipelines in order to, presumably, destroy the city. The Dark Knight manages to turn on the water and flood them out, and Isaac Evers is revealed to be the true mastermind behind the scheme. He wanted to destroy Gotham Industrial in an insurance scam. He couldn't collect following Mr. Freeze's attack without revealing his financial backers to the public, one of which had been the Joker. However, Joker's goons had turned on him. He lost control, and instead of destroying Gotham Industrial, they wanted to burn down the entire city. After Batman surrenders Dr. Evers to the police, Commissioner Gordon is struck by a batarang, and Batman is blamed for the attack. The GCPD begin hunting the Caped Crusader, leading to a pretty epic and tense chase sequence across rooftops and inside several buildings, forcing you to take on a police helicopter at one point. Thankfully, Batgirl comes to the rescue, and Batman is taken back to the Batcave. The final episode, Infernal Jest, has Batman investigating who has framed him, and to see if he can find any evidence hinting at the Joker's survival. He goes to Joker's old hideout at Funny Bones' warehouse, disguising himself as a criminal, and finds the knife Joker had been holding the night he fell from the bridge. Batman manages to track down the stolen blimp and confronts the Joker, who reveals himself as the one who has been pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating all the other villains, Isaac Evers, and even Batman himself, into helping him achieve his dastardly plan. Joker had funded Evers' liquid promethium in order to use it to make a new form of Joker toxin that is highly flammable. He had provoked Mr. Freeze into attacking Gotham Industrial, gave Ivy the chemicals so she could enhance her plants, faked his own death, and framed Batman, having the police go after him in order to distract him long enough so he could mass-produce his Joker toxin on a grand scale. He tricked Batman into turning on the water at the gasworks so he could pump his toxin into it, allowing him to essentially burn Gotham to the ground, having its citizens choke to death on their own laughter. The ultimate punchline is that Batman made it all happen. The Caped Crusader manages to shut down the flow of chemicals and defeats Harley Quinn along with her henchman Fatty, a large clown armed with explosives, a flamethrower, and a jetpack. Hilarious. Before following the Joker to his blimp for one final showdown. You disarm him of his Tommy gun with a well-aimed batarang, and then battle him much like you did on the bridge at the beginning of the game, mano a mano. Once the Joker is defeated, all of the villains get locked up in Arkham Asylum, and Commissioner Gordon thanks Batman for saving the city and apologizes to him. The police had found Harley Quinn's fingerprints on the batarang that hit him, and Batman is relieved of all charges. The story of Batman Vengeance is pretty solid and engaging. At that time, this was easily the best narrative found in any Batman game up to that point. The graphics, awesome cutscenes, and overall visual design of this game effectively capture the look and atmosphere of the show it's based off of. It feels like you were playing one long interconnected episode of the series. It features the voice talents of several actors and actresses reprising their roles from the DC animated universe. You have Kevin Conroy as Batman, Tara Strong as Batgirl, Mark Hamill as the Joker, Arlene Sorkin as Harley Quinn, Diane Pershing as Poison Ivy, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. as Alfred, Bob Hastings as Commissioner Gordon, and Michael Ansara as Mr. Freeze, in what would be his final performance as this character before his death in 2013. Compared to newer Batman games, most notably the Arkham series, which clearly took influence from this game in areas, Batman Vengeance does feel a bit more tame in regards to its narrative and gameplay. Its story features a small handful of Batman villains, making it feel far less eventful and even a bit underwhelming by comparison, but I don't think it damages the overall enjoyment you have playing this game. It's still a very satisfying experience, even after all these years. The first-person mode is easily its weakest aspect, along with its fixed camera when playing in third person, but the game makes up for it with its incredibly gratifying combat system. I have seen a few people label it as button mashing, and nothing more. Also, that enemies will sometimes gang up on you, making it really difficult, but these same people refuse to mention the ability to block, as well as perform the various takedowns, making me believe they simply do not know how to play this game, didn't take the time to look up the controls in the menus or something, because this combat system does have a level of strategy to it, and the takedowns are very easy to perform, and like I had mentioned earlier, you can turn the tables in a fight by using them very quickly, so I don't understand some of these complaints regarding it. The hardest part of this game doesn't lie in its combat, it lies in the aforementioned first-person mode and fixed camera that can lead to countless unnecessary deaths. The placements of checkpoints can also be frustrating in a few areas, mainly the gasworks level, because you basically have to beat like 90% of it before you get a checkpoint. It's the level where the issues regarding the first-person mode and fixed camera are the most apparent, at least in my opinion. While the combat system in Batman Vengeance is great, one of its strongest elements, I do wish there was more of a focus on stealth, because the framework is there. The game tries to push for it a little bit, but then doesn't follow through with it for whatever reason. It's like the developers ran out of time or something, forgot to take all the references to being stealthy out of the finished game. It's really odd. Batman Vengeance features a few puzzles, and I found most of them to be quite enjoyable. One has you lining up colored paths to redirect currents and unlock a series of electrical doors. Another has you finding 3 numbers to get into the Funny Bones warehouse, located on 3 separate statues, symbolizing the wise monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. And on Joker's blimp, Batman is forced to mix chemicals together, creating Joker's favorite colors, purple and green. While the puzzles aren't that challenging, I did enjoy their inclusion nonetheless. Batman Vengeance is still a very strong Batman game, and one of the best based off the DC animated universe, though I would still put The Adventures of Batman and Robin for the Super Nintendo above it. It had a sequel entitled The Rise of Sin Chu, released in 2003, featuring an original villain created by acclaimed comic book artist Jim Lee, which is pretty cool. I do own it in my collection. It allows you to play as additional characters such as Robin, Nightwing, and Batgirl, but I don't know when I will be able to cover it. It features a multiplayer option that I would prefer to play and capture the footage with, maybe with my brother or something, but until the world can return to some form of normalcy, that option is off the table right now. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've played Batman Vengeance before, let me know what you thought of the game in the comment section down below. I also want to thank all of my patrons for voting for this topic on patreon.com. Your support makes video projects like this possible. I will see each and every one of you in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy. So, Batman Rise of Sin 2. Sequel to the mostly amazing Batman Vengeance. Unfortunately, this is one of my least favorite Batman games. A common complaint I see about this game online is that the gameplay is very repetitive, and yeah, it's a button masher, a beat-em-up that doesn't really do anything all that special with the formula we've seen time and time again. But I wouldn't say the combat itself is what I hate most about it, because it can be fun in short spurts. The problem is how the levels in this game are structured, how boring and repetitive the objectives in them become. All you do in this game from start to finish is defeat a certain number of enemies, locate hostages, or locate bombs. That's it. Those 3 tasks in varying order. The only levels that deviate from those three things are the ones where you fight the boss villains, or, in one instance, are forced to defend the entrance to the Batcave from intruders. There are 4 playable heroes, Batman, Robin, Nightwing, and Batgirl, that each have their own set of unlockable moves and combos. Variety is always nice. You can also play multiplayer co-op, which is cool, but that's not enough to distract you from what boils down to a sickeningly repetitive superhero game. Much like its predecessor, Batman Vengeance, Rise of Sin 2 is based on the television series The New Batman Adventures, set within the DC animated universe. It features the voice talents of Kevin Conroy, Tara Strong, Lauren Lester, and Scott Menville, reprising their roles of Batman, Batgirl, Nightwing, and Robin respectively. The story takes place on the anniversary of Thomas and Martha Wayne's murder. Batman learns of massive breakouts at Arkham Asylum and Stonegate Penitentiary, and en route to the Gotham Courthouse to meet with Commissioner Gordon, the Dark Knight is attacked by the Scarecrow. The incarnation of Scarecrow from the New Batman Adventures, voiced once again here by Jeffrey Combs, is one of my favorite versions of him, second only to John Noble's in Batman Arkham Knight. His design is just so creepy looking, like a corpse that had just been cut down from the gallows. The boss battle with Scarecrow at the courthouse is pretty neat, because he fills the room with his fear toxin, which causes you to see apparitions of the Joker, Harley Quinn, and Poison Ivy that come after you. When you beat him, Batman literally leaves him hanging on the Justice statue, and you can hear him gasping for air with his little feetsies kicking. And Batman doesn't even seem to care. It's kind of funny, in a fucked up way.
Maybe this time, the Reaper will come.
No, not this time.
Throughout the levels leading up to Crane, fear gas will occasionally be released that warps the screen and disorients the player. It's a decent effect, but something much better done in games like LEGO Batman 2, for example. Here, it kind of hurts the eyes after a while, and gives me a headache. I also find it disappointing that when Scarecrow's goons transform into monsters while the gas is active, it just looks like they're in generic skeleton costumes you'd find at your local Halloween store. I don't think the developers pushed the fear visuals as far as they could have in this game, and it makes me wonder what Batman and Robin are afraid of, if this is what they see while under the effects of the fear gas. Are the Caped Crusaders scared of skeletons? If so, that's really weak. After defeating the Scarecrow, Batman is informed by Commissioner Gordon that Matt Hagen, Clayface, has taken over the Gotham Chemical Factory, with the intention of turning the citizens of Gotham into clay creatures like himself. Revenge for Batman, not helping Hagen cure his own ailment. I think the boss fight against Clayface was a key inspiration for the one we would later see in Arkham City, with all the smaller clay extensions of him attacking you in between phases. I actually really enjoy this boss encounter. It's probably my favorite in the entire game. To damage Clayface, you have to electrocute him by overloading the substations on the rooftop with your batarangs. Bane is another one of the villains featured in this game, but he doesn't play into the story a whole lot, apart from just working for the big bad and everything. He doesn't have his own unique motivations as to why he's there. I never really liked this version of Bane from the New Batman Adventures. The redesigned mask with the spiked collar looked kind of silly to me, and reminds me too much of the Bane from Batman and Robin, R.I.P. to both Jeep Swenson and Joel Schumacher. His boss battle is also the weakest in the game as well, because all you do in it is time your dodge roll and then mash buttons to attack him. I don't feel there is as much strategy to it compared to the others. It is pretty funny seeing his grab move though, where he breaks your hero's back over his knee, with the Tim Drake Robin especially, makes him look like a little dolly in Bane's massive arms. Once Clayface is apprehended in the story, we are introduced to the main selling point and gimmick of this game, the title villain, Sin Tzu, created specifically for the game, much in the same way the Arkham Knight was for Batman Arkham Knight a decade or so later. Created by veteran comic book artist Jim Lee, Sin Tzu is a warlord from Southeast Asia who conquers entire countries and enslaves their populations. He was designed to be a strategic equal to Batman, seemingly one step ahead of the Dark Knight at all times. His master plan involved being deliberately caught by the police and imprisoned at Arkham Asylum, where, from within, he orchestrated a mass breakout of villains at both Arkham and Stonegate. His ultimate end goal is to turn Gotham City into the newest stronghold of his growing empire. On paper, Sin Tzu is somewhat interesting. I like a few of the visuals with him in the cutscenes, showing him looking down on Gotham as if it were one big chessboard, and Batman acting as a pawn. I also like the idea of him being a master martial artist who studied the ancient practice of meta sua, which allows him to channel his mental energy to increase his physical strength and control the minds of others, an ability he uses against the other villains in this game, forcing them to work for him. But something about Sin Tzu also feels very stereotypical and a bit unimaginative to me, like we've seen this kind of character countless times before. The boss battle against Sin Tzu is kind of cool because it takes place within the heart of Arkham Asylum. He releases powerful bursts of energy out of his body that knock you back, and much like the fight against Scarecrow, the screen will warp at certain points, but this time your controls become reversed throughout its duration due to Sin Tzu's mind control. This effect occurs on and off in all of the levels in Arkham Asylum leading up to your encounter with Sin Tzu, and it's incredibly annoying. They happen far too frequently and last for way too long, that it makes it extremely difficult to defeat the hordes of enemies thrown at you this late in the game, even in two-player. I think it was a cheap way for the developers to extend the length of this game in all honesty, something I feel was unnecessary seeing as how repetitive the gameplay is. The final stage, right before the battle with Sin Tzu, became impossible for my brother and I to complete. You have to save 9 civilian hostages in succession, the most of any hostage sequence in the game, without losing all of your lives, all while dealing with this disorienting screen effect that can last upwards of a minute each time. With your controls reversed, you're bound to take damage and miss attacks, and no matter how hard we tried, we just couldn't make it to the end. So, we were forced to use cheats. We may have been able to overcome it with a bit of practice and patience, but we had become mentally exhausted by the repetitive nature of this game, and just wanted it over with. Even though Batman Rise of Sin Tzu has a few solid story elements and a nice presentation with its graphics and cutscenes, based of course on the new Batman adventures within the DC animated universe, it's still one of the worst Batman games I've ever played, because its gameplay is just so bare-boned and stripped down that it's heartbreaking. I have a very strong feeling that most of the time and resources that went into developing this game was probably just focused on creating the character of Sin Tzu, getting Jim Lee's involvement to design and everything. Ubisoft put all their eggs in the one basket, and they either maxed out their budget or simply ran out of time before its release date to nail down a fun and rewarding gameplay system to back it all up, because it feels like, outside of Sin Tzu, everything else in this game was thrown together at the last minute. Regardless, Rise of Sin Tzu is a far weaker game than its predecessor, Batman Vengeance. There is just no comparison. Even if you factor in the awkward first-person mode Vengeance uses throughout its levels, the story in that game is more interesting. The combat is a lot more engaging. There's platforming and puzzle-solving elements, a better use of Batman's gadgets. Even the title card loading screens are nicer to look at. The ones in Rise of Sin Tzu look lazy and uninspired. It really pains me to be so harsh on this game because I love Batman, I love the DCAU, and I love Batman Vengeance. It doesn't seem possible for this game to be as disappointing as it is, but here we are. Unlike Batman Vengeance, that I feel holds up relatively well, Rise of Sin Tzu is a disaster to sit through. Yeah, the story and cutscenes are fun, so are playing some of the boss battles, but getting to them, slogging through all of the mind-numbing gameplay in between is a chore, and leads to a long and strenuous playthrough. Just avoid this game. It's as simple as that. It's not worth the effort. I want to thank you all for watching my review of Batman Rise of Sin Tzu. If you have sat through the game before, I feel your pain. I would love to hear your thoughts on the game down in the comments section below. If you'd like to help support the channel and ensure the production of more videos like these, think about subscribing, hitting that bell icon, and becoming a producer for my channel over on patreon.com if you can. You can even nominate future video topics over there as well. I will see you all in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and always stay nerdy. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker is one of the greatest animated superhero movies ever made. If it's been a while since you've watched it, go watch it again now. It holds up really well, and is one of the darkest and most riveting sequences featuring Batman and the Joker you'll ever see, across all forms of media. There was a video game adaptation of the film released for the Sony PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Game Boy Color in late 2000. The PS1 version is the one I will be reviewing today, and with this review, I'd have looked at all of the video games based on the DC animated universe I set out to analyze on the channel. The fact that any game based on Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker exists, let alone one on the original PlayStation that's this bad, is an absolute disgrace to the movie, a slap in the face, and a kick right to the private parts of anyone choosing to put themselves through it and endure its awfulness. Return of the Joker is a 3D beat-em-up that has you play as Terry McGinnis, the new Batman, in his futuristic batsuit, housing various offensive and defensive capabilities. You get to utilize a variety of weapons and gadgets, such as a bladed staff, electrified nunchaku, forearm shields, and a slew of batarangs to battle the Joker and his stooges, Woof, Bonk, Ghoul, Chucko, and even the Dee twins, the granddaughters of Harley Quinn. On paper, a game like this sounds admissible, but once you play it, you realize how sloppily executed it really is. The combat is extremely sluggish, and the hit detection is horrendous. You'll find yourself mashing buttons like a jackass, with most of your attacks completely missing. The weapons I mentioned, aside from the batarangs, which are long range, and the shields that allow you to absorb more punishment before dying, everything else in your arsenal feels really weak. It's like trying to beat someone to death with a piece of tissue paper. You might as well not even use them at all. They don't add anything. And if you ask me, they just make the game a lot harder than it already is. There is this really awkward suit system the game implements as well. You have the option to cycle between 4 of them. The standard one has the most balanced combat stats. The offensive one increases your melee damage. Your defensive one increases your max health. And the nimble one allows you to double jump. I get what they were trying to do with this. It's a neat idea. The Batsuit, especially the technologically advanced futuristic one from Batman Beyond, is a gadget in and of itself, but it doesn't translate that well into the gameplay. Having to constantly switch between the suits brings my nerd blood to a boil, because the only way to use your weapons is if you have the standard suit equipped. If you need to double jump to a higher ledge or get over a large gap, you need to have your nimble suit selected, being that your eyes will most likely be fixated on the action the majority of the time, not on the HUD, and all of the bat suits, aside from the defensive one, which has those bulky arm shields, look identical. You can lose track of which suit you have on, and end up suffering a lot of avoidable deaths as a result. Again, I get what they were going for, and I do think this kind of idea has some potential if it were implemented in a different kind of Batman game, in a completely different way. But how it's done here is just cumbersome. The suits don't feel very balanced, not all of them are entirely useful, and switching between them could be made even easier. Opening up a selection screen is annoying, and breaks up the flow of gameplay. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker, the game, has the exact same story as the movie. In the mid-21st century, Bruce Wayne has retired as Batman, having not donned the cowl in over 20 years. Through a series of tragic events and some selfish behavior, fate brings teenager Terry McGinnis to Wayne's doorstep, and he becomes the new Batman, the Batman of the future. A street gang has appeared in Gotham City, calling themselves Jokers, and have been orchestrating a series of thefts of high-tech computer operating systems. Terry goes to the Air and Space Research and Development Lab to stop their most recent caper. After some investigating, he learns that the arch-nemesis of the original Batman, long presumed dead, the Clown Prince of Crime himself, the Joker, has somehow been revived, and has been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Joker's plan is to use the stolen tech components to take control of one of the US government's orbiting defense satellites and destroy Gotham City with it. It's up to Batman to prevent that from happening. The whole scheme of the Joker in the film, his motivations, how he ends up coming back to life, it's all rather preposterous and feels out of character for him. But within the confines of the movie, its narrative, its futuristic setting, I think it works really well. I'm not going to spoil what happens in the film for those of you who haven't seen it, because it's one of the best Batman movies ever made, in my opinion. But if you have seen it, then you will be incredibly disappointed with how the game chooses to present the events of the film. Despite the PlayStation being capable of full motion video, the cutscenes in this game, if you want to call them that, are just still images taken from the movie with text over top. It's very sad and very lazy on the part of the developers. I felt like I was watching a slideshow, and all it made me want to do was go watch the movie, not play this awful game. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker only has 5 stages: the Air and Space Facility, Wayne Enterprises, Arkham Asylum, Tim Drake's Laboratory, and the Jolly Jack Toy Factory. It doesn't seem like it would be that long, but playing through these levels feels like an eternity, because the combat is just so repetitive and tiresome. The Jolly Jack Toy Factory was my favorite stage in the game, just because of all the vibrant colors and those creepy mechanical faces, not to mention the sweet relief that my pain would be all over soon. The level that did not live up to its full potential was the Arkham Asylum one. Arkham is a scary place to begin with, but searching the ruins for clues regarding the Joker's reappearance was kind of unsettling. I just wish you were given the option to play as the original Batman in some sort of flashback, showing his final battle against the Joker like in the film. The gameplay would have still been shit, and I wouldn't have expected that level of storytelling from a game like this, but hey, just making some suggestions. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker is yet another one of the worst superhero games I've played and reviewed. If it wasn't for the torturing nature of the ring sections in Superman 64 and its overall lack of completeness, then I might consider Return of the Joker to be the worst of all the DC Animated Universe games too. Well, the ones that don't involve driving. It's just so lazy. The combat is monotonous. How it adapts the events of the film is downright pitiful, and with no level select or a password option of any kind, there is virtually no replayability either. Avoid this game. Go watch the far superior animated film instead. I want to thank you all for watching my review of Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker for the original PlayStation. With this video in the books, that concludes my look back at all of the games based on the DC animated universe, the significant ones at least, the ones I wanted to talk about on the channel. There were a few handheld games released, Batman the Animated Series on Game Boy, as well as Superman Countdown to Apocalypse, and the two Justice League ones, Injustice for All and Chronicles for the Game Boy Advance, but I don't really like to review portable games on here. Not only are they just compromised in terms of quality compared to home console games, but the vast majority of the licensed superhero ones are mediocre at best. When it comes to the games based on the DC animated universe, there are some highs, some lows, and some in-betweens, but I hope you found every stop on this journey entertaining and insightful in some way. If you'd like to support the channel and ensure the creation of more content like this, hit that subscribe button, bell icon for notifications, and become a producer over on patreon.com if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy.